everybody. Thanks so much for coming today. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Shulin Wee, who's a research advisor at the Bank of Canada in Ottawa, where she was telling me that the temperatures at the low end, it doesn't even matter if you consider whether it's Celsius or Fahrenheit, because it is so low at certain points of the winter that despite our winter storms of recent years, we still are doing better on the temperature distribution. But if you have the right coat, it's okay. Yeah, absolutely. And so Dr. Wee's been at the Bank of Canada for a number of years now, but has also been at departments in schools of business and across many different institutions in macro and labor areas, and did her PhD at the University of Maryland in College Park. Relatively new PhD, has done some really fantastic stuff on hiring, on search, and is going to be talking to us today about assertive matching and household income inequality. So we're delighted to have her. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Okay, so great. Everybody can hear me fine, right? Okay, fantastic. So thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to present my paper with Laura on assortative matching and household income inequality, a structural approach. Because I'm at a central bank, the standard disclaimer applies. Okay. So usually how I like to start is to kind of like motivate the question by showing you pictures. So the first picture I'm going to show you looks at household income inequality across time as measured by the Gini coefficient. Probably this is a fact that everybody knows. If you look at household income inequality across households, income inequality across households, it's been rising over time. Okay. The other thing that you see is that educational homogamy in marriage has also been rising. What is this word educational homogamy? It just means the fraction of joint households where both members have the same education level. Okay. So given these two pictures, really our question is quite straightforward. We want to ask, how much does the rise in marital sorting contribute to the increase in household income inequality? Okay. Even though the question sounds straightforward, there are a few challenges to examining this question. The reason is that if you see increased marriages amongst the same education, it could be due to the fact that, yes, there is increased sorting, so people prefer to match with people of the same education level. Or it could just be that over time, everybody's getting more education. Okay. So the first challenge then is to sort of come up with a measure that of sorting that's independent of these marginal distributions. Okay. Even if you do come up with a measure of sorting incentives that is independent of these marginal distributions, I think it's also important for us to recognize that all your household formation decisions and your decision of how much education you want to attain can actually be driven by the same forces that drive increased sorting behavior. Okay, so this means that usually if we think of sorting as, let's say, maybe being parameterized by some variable called theta, okay, the usual approach maybe to examine how inequality has changed is to say, well, what's the implied distribution of households of characteristics X and Y, given this sorting parameter theta. Okay, and then also, of course, you have to take into account the marginal distributions of X and Y. We're going to say that precisely because we think that these education decisions and household formation decisions depend on those sorting incentives, we want to think that the marginal distributions themselves are also a function of those sorting incentives. So the distribution of people with, let's say, college education is going to be affected by the sorting incentives themselves. Okay? So all this means is that if you take A and B together, measured sorting is going to be an endogenous outcome. Okay? All right, so how do we tackle this question? We're going to take a structural approach. We're first going to think of individuals engaging in a frictional labor market. And so individuals here have differential exposure to non-employment risk. Okay. The other market that we're going to engage in is a frictionless marriage market with transfers. And so we're going to be able to write down a marital surplus associated with each pair type. Okay. Finally, there's going to be an education market where education is costly, and the benefits of education are going to be dictated by the labor and marriage market returns. Okay. Lastly, we're also going to include unobserved heterogeneity into the model because we think that there's selection into marriage and education. Also, over this period of time, there's been a lot of increased educational attainment. So you might think that the sorting then happens on a different dimension, the unobserved dimension. Okay. All right. So for us, sorting is going to be encoded in marital surplus, which is itself just a function of those labor market primitives. Okay, we're going to then take our sorting, which is encoded in marital surplus, and see how people are going to choose how much education to get, whether or not to get married, based on the marital surplus that they expect. Okay, so that's the approach that we're going to take. What do we find? Specifically, we're going to estimate the model with the goal of identifying those labor market primitives. When I talk too fast, I mess up all my words. Okay, primitives for the 1980s and 2000s. And our estimated model is actually going to capture that predicted growth that we see in household income inequality across the time period. And then we're going to say, okay, now that I've estimated the model, let's quantify the impact of sorting on inequality. And we're going to do it two ways. One, which we call a partial equilibrium way, where we hold fixed the supply of marriage individuals. So I'm holding fixed the marginals. Okay, basically, if you go back to the equation I showed you here, sort of doing the first one. Okay, I'm only going to change the sorting incentives, don't change the marginal distributions. Okay. And then we're going to do a GE approach, where basically we do allow those marginals to respond to those sorting incentives itself. Okay. What's the key result that comes out of this? For us, actually, sorting matters a lot for inequality. We find that when you take the GE approach, it accounts for more than half the increase in overall income inequality over time. Okay. If we did the PE approach, where we hold fixed the marginals, we find the impact is very limited. So for us, the impact is limited for a particular reason. If I hold fixed the supply of married individuals, and suppose there is an increased demand coming from like this sorting incentive to marry a particular type of partner, the supply can't change, right? The supply of individuals are fixed. So instead, what is going to change in my model is the prices to clear the marriage market. And so for us, what's happening is that prices within the marriage market are moving to absorb some of that increased incentive to sort. And so that's why we find a very limited partial equilibrium effect in our model. Okay. So we're not the first paper to talk about this question. Yes, the thing I call a transfer. The way we're going to split the surplus between you and me within a joint household. That sharing rule is basically going to change to clear the marriage market. Yeah.
And that's set effectively at the time of marriage.
It is set at the time of marriage. So yes, you're sort of like thinking, how does this model work? You already have one of the.
It's actually clarification.
No, but completely correct. It's going to be set during the time of marriage. So marriage is going to be a stage 0 decision for us, date 0 decision. Okay. So yeah, very crowded field, including work by people here and very important work by people here. I would say that where we sort of come in is to sort of tie in household search and thinking about how that affects inequality from a general equilibrium perspective. So that would be our contribution. Okay. As I've sort of mentioned, and I'm always sheepish when I mention this, we have a very simple model that I'm going to show you today. What we want to push is the general equilibrium aspects of it. Okay, so you might say that, can't you do a richer model? The answer is yes, it would be very nice to do the richer model, but what I'm showing you here today is to push that general equilibrium story. Okay. All right, so what's the model going to look like? Time is going to be continuous. I have risk-averse agents who are going to discount the future at rate roll. Agents are going to derive utility from both the consumption of private goods and from a public good. Okay. XNT, my agents are going to differ by their gender, and they're going to differ by their unobserved skill. Okay, so there is some innate skill that they all have. We're going to make it very simple. Some are low skill, some are high skill. Okay, exposed agents are going to differ by several dimensions, at least dimensions that they differ by come from their choice decisions. So they're going to make choices about education. They're going to make choices about their marital status. And of course, then there are going to be different types of households coming from these decisions of education and marital status, and also their employment status. Okay. All right. So an individual I or gender S born into this economy undertakes 3 decisions. One decision that it takes is basically an education decision. So what does education do in my model? Well, education is very simple. If you go and get educated, you get a certain level of schooling. That's going to change your productivity at work. And so it's going to change your effective labor input by a scaling factor A of E. Okay. Education, however, is costly. So individuals are going to have an idiosyncratic draw of schooling costs. Let's call that K. Okay. And given that idiosyncratic draw of schooling costs, they'll choose the amount of education they want, given the expected benefit. Individuals are also going to make a marriage choice. And so here they're going to have some marital preference shots or marital preference draws. And they're also going to know what expected economic marital surplus is. So given these marital preference draws, as well as the economic marital surplus, individuals will choose whether they want to marry and whom they want to marry. Okay. Finally, there's going to be labor market search. And sort of coming back to Hoyt's comment earlier, education and marriage take place at a date zero. So we're assuming that by the time you enter the labor market, you've made your education and marriage choices. Okay, those are irreversible and you enter the labor market. And when you enter the labor market, well, when you get to the labor market stage, you're going to receive these idiosyncratic participation disutility drops. Okay, so entering the labor force is going to be costly from a utility perspective for the individual. And the way you want to think about it is that when you enter the labor force, you have to sort of get yourself labor market ready. So that's the disutility cost that you face. Okay. Conditional on choosing to enter the labor market is frictional. So you're going to receive job offers at some +1 rate. Right? Okay, so like I mentioned, education and marriage are date zero choices. And then you enter the labor market, which means that we can solve this model backwards. And so the first stage I'm going to talk about, ironically, is the last stage. We're going to solve it backwards. Okay. All right. So what are the events that can happen to you? If you're employed, you're going to earn a wage rate W per unit of effective labor input. Where does this wage rate come from? Well, it comes from a wage rate that is drawn at the time of meeting from an offer distribution that's called F. Okay. If you're non-employed, however, you have no wage, and instead you have a home production rate B per effective unit of labor input. Okay. Each instant you're going to observe these IID draws, this utility draw psi from a distribution H. And given the psi that you draw, you're going to decide whether or not you want to enter the labor market. Okay. If you enter, I consider you unemployed, and therefore you are going to receive job offers at a rate Q that depends on your skill level X. Okay. Of course, if you receive an offer, then you decide whether or not you want to accept that offer. Okay. If you're employed, it's also on the job search, you're also going to receive offers, but at a different rate, lambda. Okay. Again, lambda depends on your skill level. Okay. There's going to be, of course, then exogenous separation rates, so people don't stay employed forever. And these separation rates differ by your skill and also by your marital status. We need it to differ by marital status because the non-employment rates of males and females in joint and single households are very different in the data. Okay. All right. So the thing to take away from this series of events that I've shown up here is that skill actually matters a lot for your exposure to non-employment risk because it affects your offer arrival rates, it affects your separation rates, and it also affects your on average the disutility that you draw from participating in the labor market. Yes.
Now I have a clarifying question.
Yes.
Selectivity, which is the value of home production. It's fixed by the productivity of the person, which seems to put in the assumption that there's no like wealth or income effect of the value you get from the home production. That is to say, to put it crudely, like a billionaire about puts the same monetary value on some of their children as does, an ordinary person. The willingness to pay to improve their kids' whatever utility, which seems like that's wrong.
I may not be following exactly. I agree that conditional on having the same amount of schooling level, if and maybe this becomes clearer in a bit when I show you the what do you call that, the value functions, there is no savings technology. So when you're sort of mentioning wealth, it is true that the only difference between, let's say, an employed person earning a high wage versus a non-employed person who is just having a home production rate of B, right? The only difference between them would be would just be basically the differences in their wage versus the home production rate if they have the same education level. But there is no wealth here right now, okay?
That's a red herring. I think the point is that the other partner, so there's let's suppose it's the non-employed and the employed partner, right? And let's crank up the employed partner's wage.
Yep.
Well, I would expect that's raising kind of the joint value of home production. And
not so
from what I'm seeing, that's not. Well, let's suppose that might be false, might be true, but I'm saying you're assuming that it's not.
Yes, we basically have that it will change your value of wanting to stay out of the labor force through changing the reservation threshold you have for participating. So it doesn't come through home production itself, it comes through a different area, which is what disutility are you willing to incur to participate in the labor market. So there's still some of that going on, it's just not showing up in home production itself.
Have you shown us the utility function?
I have not shown you the utility function yet because I haven't gotten there, but now we are here. Okay. So,
yeah, but yeah. I wonder if part of question is about how home production enters utilities,
That's a good response.
or how it interacts with private consumption.
Basically, through just a simple maximization problem, I'm going to here, if I show you the single non-employed, let's start with that because these questions are all coming up like, how do you model this, right? So let's jump in here. If you have some income coming from home production, once again, I'll just finish my sentence again.
Yeah.
And then basically, given your income from home production or from wage, if you're going to be employed, you're going to optimally choose how much to allocate to private consumption and to public consumption. I think there's a question. Yeah.
I had a question on the previous slide. So what skills affect separation rates and arrival rates? It does not affect the wage distribution.
It does not affect the wage distribution. No.
Why not?
So when we basically looked in the data itself, and we after controlling for the fact that your college itself and having your education basically raises your wage premium, there was no differences across skill basically even when we were doing our estimation. So then we simplified the model and we said that okay, it will not vary across skill.
You already residualized in college.
Correct. Yeah. So, but let me get back to that later because I think that comes down to what we do with the estimation strategy. Okay. Okay. So let me describe to you. I sort of already described what the budget constraint looks like. You have some home production value. Okay, and you're going to ultimately choose how much to allocate to private consumption and to public consumption. Now, in the next instance, you're going to have this, and sorry, this is the value of non-employment net of the disutility from entering the labor force. So in the next instance, you're going to again draw your disutility from the distribution H, okay? And given that draw, and given the expected benefit of search, which basically comes that if you're unemployed, you receive a job offer at rate Q, dependent on your skill X. And if you get a job offer, you're going to basically say, well, is the change in value from moving to employment better than remaining unemployed? If so, then you move towards employment itself and you accept that job offer. Okay? And so I think coming to Hoyt's question, it's showing up here in this latter half, where if I have differences, we haven't seen the joint household yet, I'm showing you a single household. But if we have differences basically in someone's earnings potential, it will show up in terms of changing my reservation threshold when I want to enter the labor market. And it will also show up in terms of changing my reservation wage. So I haven't shown you the joint household yet, but these are the things to keep in mind since single household forms a good platform for understanding what the joint household problem will look like. Okay. All right. So what about a single employed person? Same thing, you get your wage income, okay, scaled by your productivity, which is affected by your education level. And then you optimally choose private and public consumption, okay? At rate delta, dependent on your skill X, you're going to separate into non-employment, okay? And at rate lambda, you're going to get another job offer and you're going to choose whether or not to accept that job offer, okay? Now you'll notice that the employed person does not suffer any participation disutility drops. Okay, remember I said that participation disutility is only drawn when you're non-employed And this is the cost that you have to face to get yourself labor market ready. If you're employed, you're already in the labor force. You don't have to get yourself labor market ready. Okay. This means that falling into non-employment is costly in our model because it not only represents a loss of wage income, it also represents the fact that when you fall into non-employment, it's very costly to re-enter because you face this utility draws. Okay, so there is going to be this non-employment is not trivial in our model in that sense. Okay. Okay, so now that we're done with the single household, which kind of looks somewhat familiar, we can talk about joint households. Joint households are going to vary by their education pairs and by their skill pairs. Okay, the joint household can also vary by the employment status of its members. Both people could be non-employed, what we call dual non-employed. The female could be working and the male could be non-employed, what we're going to call omega F. And the male could be working and the female non-employed, what we call omega N, and both could be employed. That's what we're going to call T. Okay, you're both employed. That's the value. As I also mentioned, you wrote this paper as well, right? So there are going to be these marriage prices, but the marriage prices are the surplus sharing rates. We're going to say that the female gets the share alpha and the male gets the share 1 minus alpha. Okay. Of course, these alphas are going to depend on the type of household, where by type I mean the education skill pair. Okay.
Sorry, I have another question about the timing. The skills are known at what stage to the worker?
The skills are, they're born with it. So
And there's no uncertainty about it.
They have no uncertainty about their skills. Yeah. So there is no information frictions here. It's just about timing. At date 0, you're making your education and marriage decisions. And then after that, you enter into the labor market stage. So there's no asymmetric information or anything like that. Okay, so I'll spend some time on the dual non-employed. Okay, because I think once you understand dual non-employed, it's very easy to understand all the other value functions. Okay, so here we have the dual non-employed. The flow utility is just a weighted sum of their individual utilities. So you get some income. Okay, you pool your income together. You choose optimally how much the female gets in terms of consumption. Choose optimally how much the male gets in consumption, and the rest, of course, it goes into your public consumption. Okay. So the flow utility is just a weighted sum of the two female and males joint the utilities. At each instant, each of them is going to face a disutility draw, okay? And they're going to decide based on that disutility draw whether or not they should enter the labor market, okay? Again, this object looks very familiar. It's basically the expected value you get from searching in the labor market. And here omega just represents the value that you get if you move from being a dual non-employed household to a household where one of the spouses is employed. Okay, it could be the male or female. Okay. Again, you'll notice that in terms of the threshold, my disutility threshold, how much disutility I'm willing to incur before I enter the labor market, it depends basically on that joint value of search coming here. Okay, one for the female and one for the male. Again, also the reservation wages depend on those joint values that they get from the household. Okay. All right, so we can talk about then the male-headed worker searcher household. And once you understand the male, you also understand the female's one. Okay, so very similar to the dual non-employed problem. The only difference here is that now there is some separation rate at which the male can lose his job and the household transitions to a dual non-employed household. There is some rate lambda at which the male finds a new job. And of course, the female herself is always receiving the participation disutility draw. Now, whenever the male is employed, however, her participation disutility draw is not only just a function of their characteristics in terms of education and skills, it's also a function of the male's wage. Okay, so participation disutilities are going to be changing with the employment status of the household and the income status of that household. Similarly, when we look at the female's problem of whether or not to take a job, the reservation wage of the female is also going to be changing, not only varying not just in terms of the education and skill status of that household, but the income status of that household as well. Okay. All right. Finally, they're like, joint household. I know this problem. Very simple. You have some rates of the female separating or the male separating. You have some rates of the female or the male finding another job offer. Okay, so all very standard so far.
And the consumption, the solution for consumption and public good is the same at all draws? Or this is,
Because these are net of the disutility drop. So the consumption is basically, if you're trying to find optimal consumption each period, it's just maximizing the flow utility you get with respect to your budget constraint. So they will have the same structure in terms of what optimal consumption looks like. Okay? Same equation basically. Yeah. Okay, we're going to make a simplifying assumption here. We're going to specify what preferences we're going to look at. Okay, in particular, we're going to specify that we're going to specialize to lot utility. Okay, and the reason why we do this is that under lot utility, we can show that all our labor market decisions become independent of those surplus sharing rates. Okay, the way we prove this is through a guess and verify approach, where we basically say that that joint value that I showed you earlier of being let's say a dual non-employed household can be separated into a component that is just the sum of all those labor market rates. That's not labor market rates, surplus sharing rates, okay? And a component U tilde that is independent of those alphas, okay?
Can you state the claim again? So, not the proof, the claim. I want to understand the claim.
Okay,
Decisions.
all my labor market decisions are going to be independent of alpha. Now, what are my labor market decisions? If I'm an individual, let's go to the dual non-employed, easier to see. If I'm an individual and I'm trying to figure out how much disutility I'm willing to incur before I choose to enter the labor market, that decision is now independent of alpha. Okay.
But what does that mean? That like alpha is realized at t equals 0 and the employment decisions are realized later. So operationally, what does that mean?
Operationally, it just means that when I am, okay, so maybe I'll answer it this way. All those decisions are just level shifters, right? Because I can pull them up, they're additive. And so when I'm making this decision of whether or not to enter the labor market or not, it's almost as if like I can ignore this interceptor. What really matters for my gain is all these other parameters here that comes from education and skill, nothing to do with the alphas itself.
so no matter how they share private consumption, their labor supply decisions or the labor market decisions are the same.
Correct.
It's a transferable utility.
Correct. It's going to lead to the transferable utility result that because they're all independent of alpha, all my labor supply decisions coming from the side, right, and also coming from my reservation wage, that will also be independent of alpha. All those decisions don't matter on how we split the surplus. Okay. Is that right?
What I'm having trouble seeing here is where are the labor market decisions?
They're all inside these max operators.
Exactly, but there's an outer max where it seems here that they only choose consumption and private and public consumption.
No. They're also choosing when they are going to enter the labor market
Exactly.
in the max operator. They're also choosing when they want to accept the job in the max operator. So those are the labor market decisions that they're making.
But why are those not under the max operator in the first max?
You can essentially you could I don't think it's an issue. Yeah, I think the way we've just written it is so that it's clear that given a particular job, you're always choosing between these two things.
Right.
But I think I don't think there is an issue of whether you pull it out or not. I think probably if I pull it out, it looks like I'm taking a maximization over the expectation rather than on the individual realization of
It
size.
seems that in a previous step, you already solved for this threshold for.
No, it just says that. So again, it's not in the decision. The way you should read this is that if I had pulled the max operator out all the way to here, that would mean that I make decisions based on the expectation. I haven't realized the psi yet, and I'm going to make a decision based on the expectation. But if I put the max operator here, it says that given any draw of psi, this particular realization of psi, I choose whether or not to enter the labor market. So that's the difference, right? Whether I would pull it out or not. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask about proposition one? Mathematically, I see it works out, but like, why do you need this result? Because it doesn't seem very plausible, right? You don't really think that like labor market decisions are going to be dependent of the alphas, right? In practice.
So operationally, it gives us a very nice tractable result that we can solve things in blocks. Okay, so that's one thing that helps us a lot. It also means that when we go to the data, I can look at any labor market data and I don't have to think about the sharing problem within the household to estimate these labor market parameters. In practice, I think so long as there's commitment in the model, it should not matter. I think unless I'm moving to a world without commitment, then I would want to rethink this assumption and whether I want to use it. Okay. Okay. So where was I? Okay. So big picture. Because this labor market decisions are all independent of alpha, it means that we can solve the labor market block independently of the marriage market block. This helps us because all my labor market returns are going to form the basis of my economic marital surplus. Okay. All right. So now that we finished talking about labor market, what it looks like, let's move to the marriage market. All my individuals, because marriage market is a date zero decision, it means that all my individuals, when they enter the marriage market, they enter as non-employed. Okay. So the only value that I need to know right now comes from that value of dual non-employment. So I'm going to specify that the value to the male in the joint household pair of education E and skill X pair is going to be given by the log of their share of the surplus, okay, plus that term from dual non-employment that's independent of the alphas. Similarly, the females can be given by the log of their alpha plus the term that is independent of their alphas. Okay. Now, what this means is that if I take the weighted sum of the female's value of being in a particular joint household pair plus the male's value of being in that joint household pair, they add up to give me the total joint dual non-employment value that I showed you earlier. All right. Okay. So here's the nice result that I have that you all guessed that already. Why was I making this log utility assumption? Precisely because now that my labor market decisions are independent of alpha, I can use a result from Schulhofer rule, which basically says that, well, expected utility under a certain transformation has a transferable utility feature. Okay. And so the particular transformation that I'm going to use is I'm going to exponentiate the value to the male from being in a particular joint household and the value to the female being in a particular joint household, such that when you add it up, it's just the exponentiated value of that joint household independent of the alphas. Okay. Given that I have transferable utility and a frictionless marriage market, I can imply the result from matching with transfers. And now we can write surplus as just that joint value of being dual non-employed less the value of starting out as single and non-employed, okay, for both the male and for the female. This means that now that I can compute my labor market returns are also going to then dictate the surplus sharing rates in the end, in equilibrium. Okay. All right. Of course, we don't think that people marry only based on income and in terms of your economic potential, we hope, right? And so in period zero, to account for the fact that we don't just look at income when we choose to marry people, I'm going to have my individuals draw a vector of preference shocks. Okay, so total marital surplus is just going to be the economic marital surplus plus the preference gains from marriage from the male and female. Okay, so in terms of the individual, what he's essentially, or she is essentially solving when she gets to the marriage market, is she's basically saying, okay, in expectation, I know what all these marital surplus is, the economic marital surplus, and I have some draw of marital preference shocks. I'm going to choose which household I would like to be in. Okay, and this could include choosing to be single. All right. Okay. All right. So finish marriage market. Now we go to the education market. In period zero, the individuals are going to draw a vector of schooling costs. Given the outcome that they face in the marriage market and labor market, and given the cost that they've drawn, you're going to choose the optimal amount of schooling that they want. Okay. Okay. So that completes the model. All right, so we've got those 3 stages set up. Estimation, we're going to cheat now. Okay, we're going to use an assumption in Kyopuri and his co-authors, and we're going to assume that the marriage and education choices are simultaneously decided at date 0. Okay, so they're both date 0 objects, which means that we can write that marriage shock that you get, the marital preference shock, and your education cost into one composite shock, which we're going to call chi. Okay, and chi is just going to be drawn from your type 1 extreme value distribution with mean chi bar. Okay, all right, so now this is coming to what you guys were asking me, how did you estimate this model, right? And so let's answer that question. Like I said, because we can do things in blocks, it means that now we can focus on the labor market estimation first, and we're going to estimate labor market parameters conditional on singles versus joint households. So I'm going to estimate it for singles first, and then I'm going to do something else for joint households. I'm going to assume that joint households face the same parameters as singles, okay, except for their separation rates, because the separation rates are very different. Given these estimated labor market parameters, then I'm going to go back, calculate economic marital surplus, back out what is and estimate what are the preference shocks as well as the surplus sharing rates that I need to match the marriage and education shares in the data. So where's the data coming from? CPS. Okay, so I'm going to use the current population survey, and I'm going to restrict it to prime age workers. Reason why I'm restricting it to prime age workers is because I want these people to be of a certain age to match the assumption that I made in my model that most of these people are done with their education decision by then. Okay, so 25 to 54, I hope you're done with your education decision. You might say, maybe not so much now. Maybe people are choosing to get more postgraduate degrees even in their 30s. And then I'm in trouble, but we'll go back to that assumption later. I'm also going to restrict it to hourly wage and salary income. Okay, education is going to be a very simple cut. It's going to be whether or not you have a college degree or not. So non-college and college. Okay, skill is again low and high. And then, like I mentioned, we're going to estimate the model to match moments from 2 periods, the 1980s and the 2000s. Okay. All right. Period is a month. Certain parameters are simple. Discount rate is going to be 0.004. Price of the public good, let's assume it's 1. Okay. I'm going to normalize the scaling factor on your productivity if you have a high school education to be 1. And I'm going to get that college premium, or rather set that scaling factor if you have a college degree from the college premium itself. Okay, set it to the equals to the college premium. Offer distribution is going to be log normal, and we're going to assume an exponential distribution for the distribution of participation disutilities. That means I have one parameter that I have to worry about for the participation disutilities, that's eta. Okay, so a lot of parameters to estimate. I have my offer arrival rates, offer distribution parameters, the separation rate, the offer arrival rate for the employed, eta which affects the distribution of participation disutilities. And of course, I need to figure out the share of people who are high and low skill within each education group. Okay. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do an EM algorithm, expectations maximization. Okay. At the expectation step, I'm first going to guess how many people are high skilled within an education group. Okay. At the maximization step, I'm going to do MLE, okay, maximum likelihood estimation, to figure out what is the arrival rate of offers for non-employed or unemployed, the separation rate, and the offer distribution parameters. And our likelihood equation is very simple. It's the same as what is in Flynn and Hackman. Okay. Now within the MLE, I actually have to solve for other parameters. That's my job-to-job rate for the, or rather my arrival rate for employed workers for job offers, and the eta which determine or govern the distribution of participation disutilities that you drew from, as well as the home production value. Okay, so I'm going to make an assumption that the minimum wage I observe in the data, okay, for a particular gender, is the reservation wage for a person of a particular, for that education level. So say I take high school people, I observe a particular minimum wage for that high school person. is going to be that minimum wage is for that high school person. I'm going to assume it's the low skill person's minimum wage. Okay, his reservation wage. Okay. Given that assumption, that allows me to jointly back out the offer arrival rate for the employed, the parameter that governs participation disutilities, and the home production value. How do I do this? I'm going to match moments. Okay, so the indifference condition is going to allow me to back out B and the reservation wage of the high skill. I'm going to match the job-to-job transition rate that I see for each education and gender. Okay, and I'm also going to match the share of non-employed who is out of the labor force to pin down this data. Okay. So I realize I have like 5 minutes left, and then slightly more, 8 minutes left, and so I'm just trying to breeze through this quite quickly because I realize I've managed my time badly. Okay, so given these estimated parameters, very good update. Okay, what's the thing you need to take away from here? Besides like, okay, yeah, we estimated something. Really, what's happening over time is that labor market returns are improving, but they're especially improving for high skilled and college individuals. College premium is going up. Job arrival rates are improving for males across time, especially for the high skilled, and job separation rates are declining for females across time, especially for the high skilled. On average, for everybody, the average participation disutility you face is going down over time. Okay, so labor market returns are overall improving across time. Okay. All right. I told you I needed to do couples because I've only done the single households. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to match moments, and I'm going to minimize the sum of squared errors to figure out what is the separation rates for couples, as well as the joint probabilities of seeing a particular skill type within an education pair. Okay, the moments I'm going to match is the share of dual non-employed for a particular education pair, the share of female-headed worker searcher households, and the share of male-headed worker searcher households. And finally, I'm going to make sure that model implied average household income is equals to the data counterpart. Okay. Now, what do you need to take away from here? Separation rates are also going down for joint households, especially for females. They decline significantly for joint households. Okay. Now, this decline for females is quite stark, and it's also forming a big decline in their non-employment risk over time. Okay. Or their exposure to non-employment risk, right? Okay. The other thing that you should note is that within an education pair, most joint households are actually high skill and high skill coming out of our estimation. Okay. All right. Okay. So now that we have our labor market block estimated, we can go to the marriage market, and we're going to basically make a few assumptions to help us back out these marital preference shocks. The first assumption we're going to make is that if you're within a joint household, male and females of the same education and skill pair have the same mean value from that distribution where they draw their marital preference shocks from. Okay. The other assumption that we're going to make is we're going to say that, okay, if you are a male individual with high school education, okay, and you're single, I'm going to normalize that mean to be 0. This means that when I compare the choice probabilities across different household types for male of a particular skill level, I can back out what is the implied marital preference that they had to be in this skill level, given that I know the household value for economic marital surplus. Okay. All right. Now you might say, well, you see education, yes. How do you see skill? That's kind of nice. Our model actually allows us to do that. Because in the previous labor market estimation for couples, I had the joint probability of a skill type within a given education pair, conditional on an education pair. And I can see the share of households that are in this education pair across the total number of individuals of that gender. That allows me to back out their joint probability. So this means in the end that I can actually match the marginal distribution of education types within joint households to actually back out those labor, I always say labor market clearing because I always work with labor markets, to back out those marriage market clearing prices. Okay, the alphas. All right. All right. So what do you need to take away from this again very quickly? The economic value from marriage tends to outweigh the value from being single. So a lot of the marital preferences tend to be negative. to make people want to actually enter into singlehood to match the data. Okay. In fact, because the economic value is largest for these college, high skill households, that means that the marital preference is most negative for this household. Okay. Okay, so now after all the estimation, let's talk about the results. Okay. We want to think about marital surplus. Okay. And here, remember, a marital surplus from a particular joint household is kind of complicated. There are 4 dimensions: the education pair and the education skill, right? So I want to think about the gains from partnering your like versus partnering your dislike. And so to do that, it's easier to hold one of the things constant. So first, let me hold constant a skill pair, and let me talk about whether there are complementarities in education. So whether or not they're going to be positive sorting in education. Okay. So to do that, I can look at, given a skill pair, what is the surplus if the 2 individuals have the same education level, less the surplus that they get if they were of opposite education levels. Okay, this is just a measure of supermodularity. If this measure is positive, or basically greater than 0, then basically there's incentives for positive sorting along education within that skill pair. What do you see from this first panel? The answer is yes. Across the 2 time periods, there is positive incentives to sort by education within a skill pair. Okay. We can do the same thing with the whole fixed education. So again, we're asking the same thing. Are there positive incentives to sort by skill holding fixed and education pair? Again, a number greater than 0 means that there's positive sorting. But something that stands out for comparing across the 1980s and 2000s is that those complementaries in skill within an education pair actually strengthened in the 2000s. Now, you might say this is not surprising. My cut was high school, or rather non-college and college. More people were getting college over time, right? And so it's likely then that if you were going to have any discrimination across your partners, you were going to do it along the skill dimension. And what we see coming from our estimation was that there was greater sorting along skill in the 2000s itself. Okay, so okay, stronger incentives to sort by skill in the 2000s. Now you also should sort of take away that, well, the other thing I showed you from the labor market estimation was that labor market returns were improving, right? But a lot of those improvement in labor market returns came from improvements along the skill dimension. Your job offer rates improved, your participation disutilities were lower on average, and those vary by skill. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna, in the essence of time, I'm gonna skip this slide. This slide is just to show you that we match the growth in the data in terms of the income inequality. Okay. And if we do the same exercises as some statistical decompositions, you would find a limited impact on inequality in our model, as these exercises that do the statistical decompositions also find. Okay. All right, but let's talk about the main result I want to push, which is the thought experiment. We're going to say, give me the 1980s population of males and females. This means that I'm going to hold fix the skill shares. Okay, the unobserved skills, that's held fixed. I'm going to ask individuals to perceive that the marriage market returns and the labor market returns that they're going to get come from the 2000s. So they're going to enter the marriage market thinking that the marital surplus is what they see in the 2000s. Okay. Now, when they actually enter the labor market, I'm going to say, you were wrong. It's actually the 1980s all over again. Okay. This has the flavor of a shift share analysis, where the compositional part, the between component, comes from these decisions of which household you want to be in. But I'm keeping that within component fixed to the 1980s level. Okay. All right. So we're going to do the 2 things, GE and PE. GE, all decisions are responding to the changes in sorting incentives. PE, I'm fixing the supply of the marginal distributions. Okay. Okay. What's happening in the GE? We actually find that sorting, when you take into account how sorting itself affects these marginal distributions of education and marriage, it actually has a big impact on inequality. It explains about half of the increase in our model estimated inequality. Okay, going from the 1980s to 2000s, our GE result explains slightly over half. Okay, where is it coming from, this increase in inequality? It's true that I have a higher share of singles, and singles do tend to observe more inequality than joint households. But within singles, actually, the inequality is going down over this time period. You might say, why? It's because, remember, my preferences across time made me want to be single. Okay, I was more likely to prefer to be single across the 2 time periods, which meant that I had some higher skilled individuals in single households. Okay, and so this was causing inequality within singles to go down. What's very stark though is that if I focus within joint households actually do see quite a large increase in inequality. Okay, and this is coming from the sorting itself. Okay, so how do we want to think about why is it that households are doing more sorting, joint households are doing more sorting? We're going to focus on something called the marital education premium. What is that? Education premium is kind of like your expected value that you get from getting a college degree versus not getting a college degree. The marital education premium is, well, the additional kick that you get to getting a college degree coming from the marriage market. Okay? So this means if I focus on females first, okay, I can decompose your education premium to the part that comes from a marital education premium versus the part that comes from a single education premium. Okay? What stands out in our results? Well, education premium is increasing over time, but the increase in the marital education premium is larger for female households, okay, in terms of how much it contributes to the total change in education premium. So these high-skilled female individuals are actually seeing a larger increase, okay, proportionally in terms of their marital education premium compared to these females who are low-skilled. Similar for males, everybody's education premium goes up, but the majority of the education premium can be explained by the increase in the marital education premium for high-skilled males, not so much for low-skilled males. So 74% versus 24%. So why is this the case? Intuitively, if there is an increased demand for people to sort and marry their like, now you as a high-skilled individual recognize that if you get a college degree, there is high demand for you. And so your marital education premium is going up a lot, okay, versus somebody who is low-skilled, okay? And so this is the additional reinforcement effect that actually causes a lot of our households within joint households to have college, and be high-skilled. So here, the increased inequality comes from the fact that we've shifted from a distribution where there wasn't many people at the polar end, and to a distribution now under our general equilibrium counterfactual, where if you were going to form a joint household and you were high-skilled, you were most likely going to be high-skilled and married to somebody else who is college-educated and high-skilled as well. Okay, so this is the thing that's causing there to be more sorting and therefore higher inequality. I've gone over time. So in the last few moments that I'm going to steal, okay, I'm going to talk about our PE effect. And like I said, the PE is where we fix the supply of married individuals. Okay, but if I fix the supply of married individuals, it turns out that in the 1980s, the supply of high-skilled males exceeded the supply of high-skilled females. And I told you that, sorting by skill went up in the 2000s, right? So you're still making your decisions as if you think marital surplus is from the 2000s, but there aren't enough people there to meet your demand. So what's that going to do? Prices adjust instead. So because prices adjust, we actually don't have much changes in the distribution of married individuals, okay, to give rise to a substantial increase in inequality. Okay. If I solve the model differently and I allow them to do a deferred acceptance algorithm, we actually do find that then in that case, prices are fixed as well, they're not changing, we will get a large increase in inequality. Okay. So all this sounds like gibberish because I rushed through the last few minutes to try and finish everything and I stole time as well. If anything, I think what we wanted to push today was to say, we get a very different result from statistical decompositions that try to say impose a sorting parameter from one period onto another, fixing the marginals. And where our different result comes from is from the fact that we sort of take into account how the decisions of who you want to marry and how much education you want to attain are affected by those sorting incentives itself. Okay, and in our model, because the distribution is responding to those sorting incentives, we get this high share of college, high skill households on that polarized end, and that's driving up inequality within joint households, which then contributes to aggregate income inequality as well. So I'm so sorry, I ran over time and I stole time from you guys as well. So, okay.
Who has questions for our fantastic?
I have a question, but somebody else should go first. All right. So someone who's married a couple that married in 1980 and stay together for a while. That's sort of a different problem than saying somebody and the prices in 2000 are different. That's kind of a different problem than somebody who gets of age to be married in year 2000. Just wondering whether your model has implications for how a couple that married under one set of prices, their behavior might change 20 years later.
So in the paper we do something by cohorts, but maybe that's more of like following the same couple in that sense. Now in terms of prices, I would want prices to change still, because this is taking into account the general equilibrium. I think that's still there, right, in our model. So you take my model, right? And then so suppose I have a person making a decision based on the 1980s surplus, right? Total marital surplus versus the 2000 marital surplus. At the time that they're making the decision, they understand that the distribution of people who take those educational choices are going to respond to those surplus. And so in that sense, it's already taking into account that prices are going to change because the supply of people are also going to respond to this marital surplus itself. So I guess coming back to your question, how do I take that? There are these people, are they facing different prices? The individuals in my model internalize that those prices are coming out of these equilibrium decisions in the end. Yeah. Does that sort of answer your question?
Well, I was thinking about marital separations and recycling marriages and so forth. Which when you said, every time you said separation, not job separation.
Job separation, yes.
Yeah, so I was thinking, we could think about how the cohort behavior might change when prices change.
So that's, okay, so
But
this
maybe
I think
that's not your model if you're not going to, there's a different model if you're going to do marital separation.
So I think there's a way to incorporate separations in the model, but it would require a few more tweaks. I need to make it look something closer to a perpetual youth model, where I need to take some people away and then put them back in, so that, yeah. So in that sense, I imagined, yeah, so okay, this depends on what I assume about the model. If I still allow everybody to start as unemployed, some of the things will still go through. I think a harder question to answer for you is that suppose I separated, I had some labor market outcomes already, and I choose to get married. That's not something that's going to be done in my model because the structure of the timing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna unfortunately have to call it, but if you have questions, we can continue those, and those who need to go to their next appointment can do so. But thank you all for coming, and we really appreciate our good